Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this weekly AgWeather update brought to you by the Farm Credit Associations of North Carolina. Our first suite of maps today all have to do with the month of July. We've got precipitation maps on the left and temperature maps on the right. And I want to dig into this for just a second, because throughout much of the Mid-Atlantic down through the Carolinas, this was overall a decent July in terms of total accumulated precipitation. If there was drought that was developed, it was on very small regional basis where just basically some of the thunderstorms missed. But when you average it out over climate districts, we can see that most climate reporting districts were reporting on the wetter side of average, given this data set, which goes back 130 years. Now, just take a quick look around the rest of the country. July was a bit hotter and drier in parts of the western Corn Belt. Major flooding rains came through parts of Missouri, Illinois, over into eastern Kentucky. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. And there was some late month drought relief down here in parts of the Mid-South and Southern Plains. One of the most active southwest monsoons I've ever seen. And we need to see how this is all going to shake out here in the next month or so. We're going to get to that in just a second. But first, here's just a new map. I don't show you this very often. It's an aridity index. So you can see up here, they take the standard average high temperature departure, and then from that, they subtract the standard precipitation departure. So what you end up getting here is these negative numbers, these very positive numbers would indicate where things were very hot and dry, whereas you can see in the color shading here where things were above average in terms of precip. And what I want to illustrate here is that we were very close to normal across North Carolina. Now, as of late, there's been extremely heavy rainfall in the northern part of the state and also over toward the Appalachian Mountains. Getting to the other side of those mountains, though, we had two major flooding events, one that went through St. Louis, the other one that went through parts of eastern Kentucky here. The National Weather Service has officially assessed the St. Louis flooding event as a 1,000-year flood event. That means that the probability of having a flood of that magnitude in any year is 1 in 1,000. And we haven't yet gotten the official word here from the National Weather Service, but based off of 10.5-inch rainfall event over a 2-day time period, that would put it on their precipitation frequency chart from the National Weather Service. This eastern Kentucky flood event is a 10,000-year flood event. But that sagging front delivered rain to us and also brought rain into parts of the lower Mississippi River Valley in the Mid-South, back over to the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma. And all of this was going on while I've seen one of the most vigorous southwestern monsoons I can ever remember. Now, just thinking about that, before I go back to that first set of graphics, I want to show you where we currently stand on soil moisture. This is down to 4 inches. So just a few regional spots here that still show up dry. Okay, we're drier in a big section here of the western and central Corn Belt. Still some problems in Texas. And we're going to talk more about this in just a few seconds. But if we go down a little deeper than 10 centimeters, go to 40, that's 16 inches. This is an area that I'm quite concerned about given the heat that we're going to see here very soon. But you don't see the problems over here in the Mid-Atlantic or in the Carolinas. And you can see the presence of that front tying itself up to the southwestern monsoon. Now, again, before I go back to those temperature maps, take a look at the forecast. We see better rains now being forecast for a broad section here. And I'll make a point to say that even though you see this area as drier, which includes the eastern half of North and South Carolina due to the subtropical ridge, there will be storms that get into here. I'll show you that in just a few seconds. But before we do this and get into that forecast, let me just come back and now let's talk about temperatures. And I want to slide over here and show you low temperature ranks. Because here along, our eastern climate zones, this was a top 2, 3, and even top 10 warmest overnight low temperatures we've had on record. These records go back to 1893. But look at the Mid-South, the Southern Plains, the Four Corner States, the West. I mean, we had some very, very warm nights this July. The average temperature ranks, though, look something like this. And so we were much closer to average. We were a little warmer than average, which, to be honest, was well forecast by the long-range models. But Texas, absolutely baking. Same thing for parts of the Southwest where that monsoonal circulation is just cranked right now. But overall, that flow pattern, especially at the end of the month, had a big ridge here and a broader trough in this area. Now, I'll ask the question here in a few moments as to whether or not that's going to persist here in the near term, but I want to come back to another temperature map to get this long-term discussion going. You see, the latest sea surface temperatures as of July 31st continue to show the strong trade winds causing the upwelling, giving us this signal for a strong La Nina, very strong summer La Nina. The other factors are the warm water here in the North Pacific. And this warm water, I think, is the most critical piece to this, because if that warm water was closer to the coast, we would get more west coast ridging and Midwest to East Coast troughing. Instead, I think this warmer water is going to push that ridging farther back to the west, allowing for the flow to come in and over and around, setting up a ridge that's going to be in the middle part of the country this week and migrate to the west next week. Now, what's important about everything I just described is that there's no indication of a big subtropical ridge sitting on top of us, preventing us from getting any moisture return. So that's good. But we still have quite a bit of warm water here in the main development region, getting into the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, which means there's plenty of moisture, plenty of heat to still produce, tropical systems very soon. I'll tell you why they're not happening right now in just a second, though. But this La Nina, take a look at these ocean trade wind patterns. I mean, they're just screaming. I mean, that is, those blue-greens, as you've heard me say so many times, represent strong trade winds right here, a telltale sign of a big La Nina. And normally with strong trade winds and plenty of warm water, we'd be talking about an active hurricane season. But the latest update from the National Hurricane Center, there's no surprise here that they've still got nothing developing over the next 5 days. When you look at how we've been accumulating what we call ACE, that's accumulated cyclone energy, we're here. Normally we're ramping up in a big way as we go through the month of August into the month of September, yet we're still flatline down here. Only 2.8 units observed. Average is 5 times that. So just important to see those differences. And the models have nothing. There's nothing coming off of Africa that's going to survive. And we don't even see any development here. It's all over in the Eastern Pacific where the action is. So no major tropical cyclones. One of the big issues is there's a lot of dust in the air, and it's coming off the Sahara. We expect it to continue for a while into this week, and it's that dry, dusty air that these hurricanes, potential tropical systems, really just the thunderstorms out here, have to chew on. So we're just not getting it. But everything else is primed. I mean, if you take a look at the wind shear, it's below average. Below average wind shear is very conducive to tropical system development. So what I want to make a point to say is when this dust gets out, and these tropical systems start to form, I think the hurricane season is going to begin pretty fast and furious once it does start. Now, we don't get any indication of that in the long-term models. They're not capable of doing that. But if you look out from August 7th, the end of this week, to September 7th, the models just continue to want to anchor a ridge here. So the flow comes around like this. The subtropical high here, which is a part of our triple ridge system, there's 1, 2, and there's a third one just off the map here. This subtropical high just really doesn't want to nudge up against the East Coast, and we watch out for that. If the big subtropical high just sat right here, we would go into the worst of our summer drought scenarios. But it doesn't, and instead it stays pretty far offshore, so we kind of zoom in here and say, well, what does that mean for precipitation? Well, you just notice that the models don't advertise major risk of drought developing. Now, there is an interesting bias that sits right here over the Gulf Stream, and we have to take that into consideration when using the model output. But what it really points to, active southwest monsoon, Canadian storm track, flow coming over the top, subtropical ridge sitting here, flow comes around like that, like this, and you've heard this narrative from me for a while. That just produces fronts that stall out here, increasing the chances for precipitation. If there's an area that I'm concerned about, it's the Western Corn Belt. You'll see more about that in just a few seconds here, but that's the spot that for future drought development I'm really getting concerned about. Now, when we look at the newest update from the Climate Prediction Center, they're not only keeping an eye over the month of August on the Western Corn Belt and New England, but also back down here again centered on the Red River Valley of the South. We have seen lately better precipitation getting through here, but the question will be, how high is the heat? How much continued damage will we see in this section of the Cotton Belt, Corn Belt, Sorghum Belt? I mean, it's all grown right down in here. But take a look, just like we talked about, above average precipitation for the Carolinas through the mid-Atlantic is forecast, and no substantial heat stress. So what do we say has to happen for this to be wrong? If something changes in the North Pacific, sure, it's going to change the whole pattern. But it has to produce a big ridge of high pressure that sits here before I start talking about major drought stress developing throughout the Carolinas. And there's just no indication of that right now. Even NOAA's drought forecast does not show drought development here. It has it in a few places. But drought improvement in through this region through the month of August. So that's why I kind of called into question the rebuilding of drought here. But I mean, you just look at this map, which was updated over the weekend, and we continue to see a wash, rinse, repeat of the pattern we saw back in June and early July. What happened over the last week was relatively temporary. So just given that as our long-term setup, and by the way, at the end of this week, on the night of the 5th, I'll get brand new long-range updates. I'll include them in next Monday's report. These will be a 7-month forecast. So we'll take a look at that. But before we get that, let's just go see what's going on right now. This is just checking in on some satellite data from this morning. And we watched a complex of storms that kind of came through Illinois and Indiana. And there's always question as whether or not these storms can kick their outflow all the way over to us in the Carolinas. But there's still a stalled out frontal boundary here. And while that's going on, take a look at the west yesterday. I just want to show you last night. As the sun was setting, a lot of wildfire smoke here from a very active southwest monsoon. And I bring that up for a reason. The flow right now, if you just look at the low levels of the atmosphere, will be transporting some of that wildfire smoke along this front toward us. But the bigger picture is, here's this elongated subtropical ridge, no major tropical systems here. This is Frank, by the way. But coming over here into the Caribbean, curling around, so it's just going to deliver moisture. That's the setup. That's what it looks like. And the ridge that runs over the middle of this, well, you can just see it. So if all that heat and stress stays west, what we end up getting is a better chance at seeing more precip. We will see, in fact, I was just using one of my favorite sites from NOAA here. We will be seeing, let's see here. Try that again real quick. There it is. Sorry about that. We will be seeing some of the wildfire smoke get our way, though, from the big fires in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And you can see some of that coming through. So you might see some pretty red sunsets as a result of this. But in the West, this is the last day, I think, that we're going to see the excessive heat warnings in the West. The red flag warnings here in Montana will probably last till tomorrow. But look at the heat building into the midsection of the country. This is where our next major stress point is going to be. So why is that all occurring? And this is the lesson to take away from my briefing today. As we watch the jet stream level pattern, what we see is the placement of the ridge is here and here, not here. We're in between, which means we get the convergent winds. We get the better rising motion. We avoid the excessive heat, and we tend to get better precipitation. There is nothing shutting down our moisture transport, which is what we worry about this year. Now, I realize this is kind of an ugly map, so let me get you oriented. You're here in North Carolina. What we're looking for is these high values of precipitable water. We don't want to get shut down into dry conditions. So as I play this forward through this week, we're just going through the middle of the week, the end of the week, into next weekend. Do you notice with me that there's no major feature blocking our moisture transport? And this is the main reason why in every single weather forecast you look at, there's going to be just a chance every day of storms popping on the heat or a weak frontal boundary coming through. And I want to show you the timing of those frontal boundaries by starting you off this morning here on Monday. Let's get to Monday afternoon and evening. There's still a weak cold front sitting in through here, and it's going to initiate the chances for storms today. Then you get into Tuesday. You see the low that's way up here just north of Quebec? It's leaving a front in this area fed on those trade winds, wrapping things around. So we see on Tuesday a chance for some widely scattered storms. The next system by Thursday goes rolling into that same area here in Quebec. And guess what it does? Drives a front here Wednesday night to Thursday morning. See the flashes of green are fed on the tropical moisture and initiate storms. So I could just keep playing this. It's the same story day in and day out. Temps are going to be in the 90s, chances of storms in the afternoon, and the flow comes through with a westerly wind behind each front, and that's what's going to initiate the storms. The models are terrible, by the way, at predicting this. So when you look at how much rainfall they're forecasting here all the way through the end of this week, let's just stop this on Saturday night right here. You're looking at this going, well, a tenth of an inch, 0.2 inches. Well, if there's storms that develop in here, they have the capability, given that moisture I showed you a few moments ago, of delivering, an inch and a half or 2 inches of rain locally. They did it last week. but the fronts keep sliding through. And that's why the net effect is we see wetter conditions overall. By week 2, this is going out there to the 11th of August. See where the ridge is? It's not over us. So we get that northwest flow, we get convergence, we get storms, and that's why the models just refuse to show a dry bias along the East Coast. What's important about this, though, is that the models have backed off on the really dry bias in the western Corn Belt going into week 2. The likelihood of more ridge-riding storms here, if you're a corn and soybean farmer, pay attention to this, please, could mean better precipitation signals in this part of the country. So let's have a closer look at this temperature pattern. Starting off here on Monday, we're going to have temperatures in the upper 80s, low 90s across North Carolina, but watch the heat come out of the northwest and just sit by Tuesday here in the central and northern plains and western Corn Belt. Problem is, overnight lows are going to be in the upper 70s, maybe low 80s, and that's a terrible time to have such high heat here for this part of the western Corn Belt. We then get into Wednesday, we're still going to stay in the low to mid 90s. You then get here to Thursday's high temperatures, maybe a little bit more of a normal day around 90, but then you're going to watch here as we go into the weekend. There's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Our temperatures cool off a little bit, but they stay very hot in the midsection of the country. And that's why when we look forward in the longer range here, let's let this reload, you're just going to see the temperatures here in the midsection of the country stay warm while we don't see the risk of much above average heat here in parts of the mid-Atlantic. Now watch, this is a 5-day sliding window. And what do we see here? We see maybe a degree or 2 above normal, but overall the greatest heat pouring here into the middle of the month of August is tucked away in the central plains through the western Corn Belt, just an area to keep an eye out on. That's what happens when the flow does this in the jet stream. One thing I want to keep on your radar, we're 6 weeks away from planting soybeans in Brazil. But I'm a bit concerned about southern Brazil getting into Argentina because over the last couple of months, we've seen some really substantial drought hit a very productive part of Argentina, Buenos Aires over toward Cordoba, neighboring against Santa Fe. And I just think it's very soon we're going to start talking about this crop. Just to give you some numbers, we are expecting about a 4% increase in Brazilian soybean acres. Now, this is Argentina, so Brazil is up here. And therefore, the possibility of this year having 100, maybe 152 million metric ton crop is there if the weather cooperates. What is that all going to be predicated on initially? La Nina, which is why we talked about it. La Ninas tend to be drier south, wetter to the north as we get going with the growing season. So I'll watch that carefully, keep you up to date on anything happening across Europe as well, and we'll just press forward here through the rest of our summer, and I'll talk to you next Monday with some new long-range updates. Thanks.